There's a very specific moment a narcissist reaches, not when you first go quiet, not when the arguments stop, but later, once the accumulated evidence finally becomes undeniable that your silence isn't a phase, isn't a tactic, isn't waiting to be reversed by the right message at the right time. It's the moment they finally fully register that you genuinely don't care anymore. And what they do in response to that realization is worth understanding in careful detail because it reveals something important about the entire structure their confidence has always been built on. Let's start by being precise about what realizing you don't care actually means from their side, because it's easy to assume this realization arrives the same way it would for anyone else, through simple observation followed by acceptance. That isn't how it works for a narcissist, and understanding why explains almost everything about the specific behavior that follows. For most people, recognizing that someone they once loved has genuinely moved on triggers a fairly linear emotional process. Sadness, maybe some denial initially, eventually acceptance, and gradually, over time, the capacity to build something new without that acceptance requiring constant relitigation. A narcissist's psychology doesn't process this information the same way because genuine indifference from someone who used to provide emotional regulation and validation isn't simply sad news to them. It's a direct threat to the externally dependent sense of self we've discussed extensively throughout this series. Proof that a source of stability they'd unconsciously come to rely on has genuinely, permanently disappeared, with no clear path back to restoring it. This is why the realization, once it fully lands, tends to produce a response that looks disproportionate if you're only measuring it against ordinary romantic disappointment. What's actually happening underneath the surface is closer to a regulatory crisis than simple sadness. And understanding this distinction is the key to understanding everything that follows. The first thing that typically happens once this realization starts to genuinely take hold rather than being successfully deflected through denial is an intensification of contact that often surprises people specifically because of its timing. You might expect, reasonably, that a narcissist realizing you don't care anymore would simply give up, redirect their energy elsewhere, accept the loss, and move on. Sometimes this does happen, and we'll discuss that outcome later in this video. But very often, especially in the immediate aftermath of this specific realization, the opposite occurs first. A sudden, intense escalation in the frequency and intensity of contact attempts, arriving with a kind of urgency that wasn't present during the earlier, more casual testing phase we've discussed in previous videos. Here's why this escalation happens specifically at this moment, rather than earlier, when your withdrawal first began. Throughout the earlier stages, there was still ambiguity for the narcissist to work with, uncertainty about whether your distance was temporary, whether the right approach might still reverse it, whether enough time or enough pressure might eventually restore the old dynamic. That ambiguity, uncomfortable as it was, still left room for hope. And hope, however painful, doesn't typically produce the same urgent, escalating panic that genuine confirmed loss does. Once the realization fully lands, once enough evidence has accumulated that ambiguity is no longer sustainable, that your indifference is genuinely, structurally real rather than a phase waiting to pass, the psychological experience shifts from uncertain hope to something closer to confirmed crisis. And confirmed crisis tends to produce more urgent, less calculated behavior than uncertain hope ever did. This is worth understanding in practical terms because it explains a pattern many empaths report with genuine confusion. Why did the messages get more intense, not less, right around the time I finally genuinely stopped caring? It can feel deeply counterintuitive, almost like your own healing is somehow provoking worse behavior. And I want to address that directly because it's an important misunderstanding to correct. Your genuine indifference isn't causing this escalation in the sense of creating a new problem. It's revealing information that was always structurally present, simply triggered into visibility once the specific threshold of confirmed, undeniable loss gets crossed. The escalation was always going to happen once this realization fully landed. Your healing didn't create it. It simply activated a response that was already built into how this particular psychology processes exactly this kind of confirmed threat. Let's talk about what this escalation actually tends to look like in practice, because it's worth recognizing the specific patterns rather than just understanding the underlying mechanism abstractly. The messages during this phase often carry a different quality than the earlier, more strategic testing attempts. Less calculated, more raw, sometimes containing genuine seeming admissions of fear or need that weren't present in earlier communications. This isn't necessarily performed in the fully conscious, strategic sense that some earlier tactics might have been. Some of what surfaces during this specific phase reflects authentic distress, even if that distress is ultimately rooted in the loss of a regulatory function rather than the kind of person-specific grief you might have experienced processing this same loss yourself. Here's what's genuinely important to understand about this phase, though, because it matters enormously for how you should interpret and respond to it if you're currently living through it. The authenticity of the distress doesn't actually change what it requires from you, or rather, what it doesn't require from you. A narcissist experiencing genuine internal crisis at the confirmed loss of your emotional investment is still not entitled to your engagement, your comfort, or your renewed availability, regardless of how real that crisis might be. This distinction between acknowledging genuine distress and feeling obligated to respond to it is one of the most important things to hold on to during this specific phase, because the raw, seemingly authentic quality of these messages can feel much harder to ignore than the more obviously calculated tactics from earlier stages, precisely because something in you, especially if you're an empath, responds instinctively to genuine pain, even pain generated by someone whose earlier behavior gave you every reason to protect yourself from continued engagement. This is where understanding the specific mechanism behind this escalation becomes genuinely protective, because it explains why responding to this apparent authenticity, however tempting, tends to produce outcomes very different from what your compassionate instinct might expect. Here's the crucial thing to understand. Even when the distress driving this escalation is genuinely felt, engaging with it doesn't actually resolve anything for the narcissist in any lasting way. It simply, temporarily restores the exact function your absence removed, providing another dose of the regulation and validation their psychology has always depended on external sources to supply. This means responding even out of genuine compassion for what appears to be real pain doesn't actually help them process or move through this crisis in any meaningful way. It simply delays the crisis, resetting the clock on a reckoning that was always going to need to happen, eventually, one way or another, regardless of whether it happens now or after several more cycles of exactly this same pattern repeating. This is worth understanding through a specific analogy that might clarify why compassionate engagement, however well-intentioned, doesn't actually serve either of you in this specific situation. Imagine someone in genuine physical withdrawal from a substance their body has become dependent on, experiencing real, authentic distress as a direct result of that withdrawal. The distress is completely genuine, but providing more of the substance, however much it would immediately relieve that specific distress, doesn't actually help the underlying problem. It simply extends the dependency, delaying whatever process would eventually need to occur for genuine stabilization to happen instead. Your engagement during this specific escalation phase functions similarly. It's genuinely capable of relieving the narcissist's immediate distress, and that relief is genuinely real while it lasts. But it doesn't address the underlying issue, the total exclusive dependency on external sources to generate a stable sense of self. And in fact, it actively reinforces exactly the pattern that created this crisis in the first place. Let's talk about what happens if this escalation phase runs its course without your engagement. Because understanding this trajectory matters enormously for maintaining your resolve through what can be a genuinely difficult period to hold firm during. The intensity typically doesn't sustain itself indefinitely, precisely because it requires energy that isn't being replenished by any response from you. Most narcissists, facing sustained unresponsive silence during this crisis phase, eventually move into something that looks from the outside like a kind of exhausted plateau, the frequency and intensity of contact attempts gradually decreasing, not because the underlying crisis has resolved, but because the specific strategy of escalating urgent contact has itself been thoroughly tested and found to produce no result. This is where the two outcomes we've discussed in earlier videos become relevant again, and it's worth revisiting them specifically in the context of this particular realization. The confirmed, undeniable recognition that you genuinely don't care anymore. The more common outcome, once the escalation phase exhausts itself without producing engagement, is a shift toward narrative reconstruction, functioning exactly as we've described in previous discussions. Recasting your genuine indifference not as evidence of your own growth and healing, but as confirmation of a story where you're framed as cold, unstable, or simply never having been capable of the depth of connection the narcissist claims to have offered. This reconstruction serves the same protective function we've discussed before, allowing the narcissist to redirect attention toward a new source of supply while preserving a version of events that doesn't require confronting the much more threatening alternative explanation underneath it. The less common outcome, occurring in a genuine minority of cases, involves something closer to actual reckoning, not necessarily complete or immediate, but a genuine, if partial, confrontation with the specific evidence your sustained indifference represents, that this particular loss, unlike the many that likely preceded it, is genuinely, permanently different, and that no amount of the usual strategies proved capable of reversing it. This recognition, when it occurs, doesn't guarantee lasting change, as we've discussed extensively throughout this series, but it does represent something meaningfully different from the more common narrative reconstruction, and it's worth understanding as at least possible, even though it remains, statistically, the less likely of the two outcomes. Here's what's worth adding specifically to this discussion, though, that we haven't fully addressed in earlier videos covering similar territory. There's often a third pattern worth naming directly, one that doesn't fit neatly into either the narrative reconstruction or genuine reckoning categories. This third pattern involves a kind of prolonged, low-grade oscillation between the two, periods of apparent acceptance and redirection toward new sources of supply, punctuated by unexpected returns to contact, sometimes months or even years after the initial crisis phase seemed to have fully resolved. This oscillation tends to occur specifically when the underlying crisis never fully resolves in either direction, when narrative reconstruction never quite becomes fully convincing even to the narcissist constructing it, and when genuine reckoning never quite completes itself into something stable enough to prevent occasional relapses back into old patterns of testing whether your door might, after enough time has passed, have reopened even slightly. This third pattern is worth understanding specifically because it's genuinely common, and because it can be uniquely disorienting if you're not prepared for it, precisely because it doesn't offer the clean resolution either of the other two outcomes provides. You might experience genuine sustained silence for a year or more, long enough to feel confident the story has fully concluded, only to receive an unexpected message that reopens the entire question of which outcome you're actually witnessing. Understanding that this oscillating pattern is genuinely common, rather than assuming any single unexpected contact means the earlier narrative reconstruction or genuine reckoning framework was wrong, helps protect you from being destabilized by a return to contact that doesn't actually change anything about the fundamentals we've discussed throughout this entire series. So what does all of this mean for you, standing on whichever side of this process you currently find yourself? Perhaps in the middle of the escalation phase right now, watching the intensity of contact increase in ways that feel confusing given how much internal work you've done to genuinely stop caring, or perhaps further along in the exhausted plateau, wondering which of the three outcomes you're actually witnessing, or perhaps years removed, having just received an unexpected message that's reopened questions you thought were fully settled. Here's the first thing worth understanding clearly. Regardless of which stage you're currently in, your genuine indifference was never actually meant to produce any particular outcome on their side. This is worth returning to directly because it's easy, especially during the more intense and confusing phases of this process, to start unconsciously measuring your own healing against which of the three outcomes eventually unfolds, hoping for genuine reckoning, dreading narrative reconstruction, feeling destabilized by the oscillating pattern that offers no clean resolution at all. All three of these outcomes were always going to be entirely outside your control, determined by factors specific to the narcissist's own psychology, history, and circumstances, rather than anything about how well or how genuinely you manage to release your own investment in the relationship. This distinction matters enormously because it protects you from a subtle but genuinely important trap: treating your own healing as somehow incomplete or unsuccessful if the narcissist's response doesn't follow the pattern you might have hoped for. If you've genuinely structurally stopped caring, not performing indifference while secretly hoping it produces a specific reaction, but actually internally released from needing anything further from this relationship, then the specific outcome that unfolds on their side, whether it's escalation followed by narrative reconstruction, escalation followed by genuine reckoning, or the ongoing oscillating pattern we discussed, doesn't actually reflect on the quality or completeness of your own healing at all. Your healing was always a separate, independent process happening entirely within your own life, regardless of which direction their story eventually takes. Here's the second thing worth understanding, and it's the piece that actually matters most as we close out this discussion. The specific behaviors we've walked through today, the escalating intensity, the raw, seemingly authentic distress, the eventual plateau, the narrative reconstruction or genuine reckoning or ongoing oscillation that follows. None of it requires anything from you in order to unfold exactly as it's going to unfold. You don't need to engage with the escalation to help them process it. You don't need to wait around to find out which of the three outcomes eventually occurs. You don't need to interpret an unexpected message, arriving months or years after you thought this story had concluded, as evidence that anything fundamental has changed about what you already know to be true. What actually matters, more than tracking which specific pattern a narcissist moves through once he realizes you genuinely don't care anymore, is continuing to build the kind of life that doesn't require this information in order to feel complete. This is worth stating directly as the actual practical takeaway from everything we've discussed today. Understanding these patterns is useful primarily because it helps you recognize what you're witnessing without being destabilized by it, not because it gives you something new to monitor or wait for. If an intense, escalating message arrives, you can recognize it as the predictable first phase of this specific realization landing, rather than experiencing it as confusing evidence that something's gone wrong with your own progress. If narrative reconstruction eventually surfaces through mutual connections, you can recognize it as the more common, expected outcome rather than a personal indictment of who you actually are. If an unexpected message arrives long after you thought this had concluded, you can recognize the oscillating pattern for what it is, rather than treating it as a crisis requiring you to relitigate decisions you already made with full clarity. If you're currently living through this exact moment, watching a narcissist realize in real time that you genuinely don't care anymore, and watching whatever response that realization produces, I want you to hold on to something simple as we close this discussion. You already did the actual work this entire process required of you. You built the genuine indifference. You released the need for their acknowledgement, their reckoning, or even their basic understanding of what happened between you. Everything that follows on their side is simply the natural, mechanical unfolding of a psychology processing a specific kind of loss it was never well equipped to process cleanly. It was never going to require anything further from you, and it still doesn't. They may escalate. They may eventually reconstruct a story that recasts you as the villain. They may reach something closer to genuine reckoning, or they may oscillate between all of these outcomes for years, never quite settling into either extreme. Whatever happens, it was always going to happen entirely independent of anything you do from this point forward, because the only part of this story that was ever actually yours to write already has an ending. You stopped caring. Genuinely, structurally, permanently. Everything they do next is simply what happens when someone realizes, often for the first time in their entire life, that the game they've always known how to win has finally, quietly ended without them.